Much of the joy in League of Legends for me is diving into its most complex elements, fiddling with all of its moving parts to truly understand what makes the game tick. So it's no surprise, given my interest in draft theory, that I would eventually turn my attention to team compositions. Determining which 5 champions should populate your team in any given scenario, as well as how those champions should interact with each other, is a tall order, which is why having a framework can do wonders for contextualizing your knowledge. In this video, I would like to introduce the Archetype framework that I use to analyze team compositions. Then, to provide an example for how this framework might be useful, we're going to do a deep dive on an archetype that most players should be at least somewhat familiar with, the front-to-back teamfight comp. During that deep dive, we will cover the premise of the archetype, the basics of the front-to-back formation, the responsibilities of our desired classes, the core variants of the archetype, specific valuable champions and situational picks, undesirable champions, the generic early game mindset, skirmish structure and play cadence, teamfight setup, frontline combat roles, and archetypical matchups. I'm a strong believer in the theory that playing other competitive games is valuable for development in your main game. Different games emphasize different skill sets, but many of the fundamental concepts can be transferred back in some sense. In fact, I even developed some micro decision-making concepts by playing single-player games like Hollow Knight. Our archetype framework has its roots in card games. In games like Legends of Runeterra and Magic the Gathering, a significant portion of matchup analysis begins with the archetype of each deck. Whether you or your opponent is an aggro, control, mid-range, or combo deck is the entire foundation of how you should approach the game, then built upon by the specific deck you're running within those archetypes. While learning about these foundations, I was pointed towards this diagram from MTG, and it led to a realization. If a team composition in League of Legends is an analog to a deck, and if we simply replace combo with teamfight, then we can start to apply these card game principles to MOBAs. Translating these concepts back to League of Legends enabled me to define a variety of compositional archetypes under the umbrella of either teamfight, aggro, or control comps. Each archetype comes with a predefined basic premise explaining how it should be played, which is refined by the champions you draft. Failure to draft around an archetype regularly leads to dissonant comps with potentially conflicting goals, or worse, can lead to a doomsday scenario in which one champion has contradictory responsibilities within a game or a fight. By contrast, drafting around an archetype simplifies the development of your plan and makes it easier to draft champions who hit each other's synergy points. Archetype theory might sound frightening on paper. When I say to draft around an archetype, that could be interpreted as encouraging you to play your hand super early in draft if you want to end up with a strong composition. Fortunately, that's not the case. Every champion in the game has certain tendencies in favor of certain archetypes. Some are better suited to teamfight comps, others to aggro, some are fully flexible and can be played with almost anything, and others are locked to 2 or 3 specific archetypes across the entire spectrum, but very few are completely dependent on one exact archetype. Understanding which champions are archetypically flexible and which are not actually makes drafting much easier, as that's a key indicator for which champions are safest as early blind picks. So when I say to draft around an archetype, I don't mean to commit to one specific archetype from B1. I mean to recognize which archetypes are still available to you at each phase in draft given the champions you have already locked in. It's possible to have developed into a teamfight composition without having yet committed to a specific archetype, but recognizing that development prevents you from blundering draft by locking a champion that fundamentally doesn't mesh with its allies. Now, for this archetype theory to work, you do need an understanding of each core archetype. My long-term goal is to cover each one in its own deep dive, but at least for the short term, I've promised a discussion on front-to-back teamfights so we can get a feel for what exactly an archetype looks like. Please be aware that for educational and future-proofing purposes, we are completely ignoring the actual power levels of all champions during this video. Front-to-back is an extremely pure and honest teamfight archetype. The comp revolves around its very static formation, with a well-defined frontline and backline designed to protect and enable its carries in 5v5 scenarios. The carries define the composition. We typically see front-to-back comps built around 2 highly immobile backliners who benefit from the protection of the formation and who don't reliably have the option to take flanks. The inverse, though, is not true. Having a large frontline does not inherently make you a front-to-back comp. Here's an example of how front-to-back works. Our front-to-back composition on the blue team initiates a Baron play. While his team attempts to burn Baron, Ornn non-committally zones the enemy team. He doesn't want to fight to break out just yet due to the positioning of his fellow frontliners. There would be no way to build the proper front-to-back formation while Trundle's attention is on the Baron. Ornn rejoins his teammates just as the Baron falls and as the red team has approached. And given that Trundle is now by his side and that Graves has just started to set up a flank, he pulls the trigger on the fight. Now the formation structure is visible. The formation pushes forwards, attempting to buy space for their Sivir so she can deal damage, but Sivir is opened up onto by a Twitch. Immediately, with their carries threatened, the utility champions go on the defensive. Trundle and Ornn both push Twitch backwards, immediately switching targets onto Gnar once he also begins to threaten their carries. Meanwhile, Lulu dumps all of her protection onto Sivir. The formation kites back, at which point Azir notices the fight-winning play and breaks formation. After formation breakdown, Sivir is free to clean up the rest of the fight, though in this example, she's unable to find more kills. Note the coordination of the utility champions, how at all times they were mindful of the comfort of their carries, were aware of what Sivir could handle by herself, and never actively sought out kills for themselves at the expense of their teammates. This is textbook front-to-back. Front-to-back is generally viewed as one of the easiest teamfight compositions. Its premise is very simple, every champion's responsibilities are both easy to understand and to execute, it usually has low setup time around objectives, and it's very flexible in which pieces are drafted, making it more likely that amateur teams have the champion pools necessary to play it. If absolutely necessary, it's often possible to force a front-to-back composition in draft without finding yourself in an unplayable compositional matchup, again since it's generally flexible in which specific champions are drafted. With that in mind, it may be the single best archetype for new or low elo teams to play as they develop their knowledge and their coordination. While front-to-back is named for its formation of tanks standing in front of carries, it's important to realize that the formation is actually designed for the front line to stand between carries and threats. That's a very subtle distinction, but it means that we should visualize the formation as a ring instead of a line. If the team finds themselves as 5 in a side lane for brute force siege, it may be correct to take a horizontal position, where the front line leans towards the jungle as the formation moves forwards down the lane. In some anti-flank positions, a frontliner may be needed behind the carries, which weakens the formation as a whole, but at least provides coverage where it would have been lacking. Front-to-back isn't truly a misnomer for the archetype, it still strongly prefers to fight in a single file, but there's nuance in how the formation should be positioning around itself. So now that we understand the core premise of a front-to-back comp, we should know how to build one. What are the core components of this archetype? Which classes of champions are available to our frontline and our backline? Front-to-back is a moderately flexible archetype. What they lack in formation flexibility, they make up for in variations in range, ideal combat direction, and formation structure. So to understand how to account for those variations and predict what your specific front-to-back game plan should look like, we need to outline the standard responsibilities and desired traits of champions within the ideal front-to-back classes. The front line can be composed of initiators, bruisers, wardens, and mid-range champions. Initiators are a very core component of proper front-to-back. If you have a backwards moving front-to-back formation but with no initiator, you're most likely a bait and punish composition, which is an excellent archetype in the right situations, but it fundamentally plays differently. It's a control comp. So an initiator is an essential component to this archetype. Teamfight comps do need to be able to cause teamfights after all. Our preferred initiators in this context are either exceptionally durable or can dish out AoE CC, since we expect them to have to buy enough time for the backline to catch up safely. Bruisers in front-to-back act as the core support to the other frontliners. The ideal bruiser is capable of facilitating their initiator by providing follow-up catch and damage, but is not overly cooldown reliant, which would mean that they cannot peel back to their backline for protection. Wardens, meanwhile, are the core support to the backline. Their primary responsibility is to properly integrate the backline into any teamfight, which is usually achieved by protecting carries and standing directly in front of them, but which can sometimes be as simple as supporting the initiator as a bruiser would. It's context dependent. The frontline can sometimes be rounded out by a mid-range champion. These are effectively forward-positioning backliners who bridge the gap between the two halves. Some dynamically swap between standing in the frontline and the backline, others almost become frontliners by standing beside other frontliners. The backline is populated by carries and utility. As mentioned, the carries are often immobile marksmen or mages, ideally high damage and high range, benefiting from the formation. Although many variants of front-to-back value high range, the formation must limit the number of actual poke champions. Any more than one, and you become a hybrid siege comp, which again plays dramatically differently. The utility champions, meanwhile, are almost always enchanters, optimally those which protect their fellow backliners from dive or flank threats while demanding little protection themselves. The enchanter should be the last line of defense against threats that the frontline cannot handle, transitioning to a mid-range role to support the frontline only when the carries are guaranteed safe. I've listed more than 5 types of desirable champions for front-to-back comps. Obviously, we can't draft them all in one game, so how do we determine which fit our needs? That's where understanding variants can help. Every archetype has variants, different versions of the archetype which all follow the same general premise, but which make changes to their comp structure to achieve different strengths and weaknesses. Front-to-back at the time of recording has 4 known variants. The triple frontline variant is self-explanatory. It consists of 2 carries in the backline and 3 champions in the frontline. Triple frontline tends to be a forward-moving variant, taking the philosophy that a larger frontline capable of taking space in a fight translates to protected and effective carries. When building a triple frontline comp, don't forget to check the needs of your carries. Short-ranged carries call for more wardens, while longer-ranged carries call for more bruisers or initiators. If a long-ranged carry requires less risky positioning, then they don't call for the entry facilitation that wardens provide, allowing us to draft more core support for the frontline, which in turn allows the frontline to spread out the formation and take longer-ranged engages. Of course, even with long-range carries, you might find situations in which wardens are necessary to handle specific enemy threats. Here are a few examples of triple frontline compositions. The first is a double initiator draft using Leona as emergency peel. This comp would engage quickly, capitalizing on their range and performing well into poke, but might struggle if threats reach their backline, especially post-engage. The second is reasonably well balanced with a strong skirmish. This comp has high catch potential and should perform better than the first into flank and dive thanks to Tahm Kench's protection. The third is a short-ranged warden-heavy comp using Graves as a primary carry. This one is the hardest to directly approach, but should struggle against enemy comps who prefer to kite backwards. Note that Ziggs is a long-ranged solo poke carry who doesn't necessarily need warden support, but his presence is valuable if the enemy draft isn't quite as short-ranged as ours. This composition has 3 frontliners, some catch potential, and 2 immobile carries, but actually, this is not front-to-back. It has no initiator. If Poppy or Aatrox were to act as the primary initiator, they would not be able to do so from formation. So in order to teamfight, this composition would not be able to consider themselves as a front-to-back. Otherwise, they would almost surely lose. Now, at this point, it's worth putting an asterisk on a point from earlier. Front-to-back requires initiators, unless you can use traditional pick or disengage tools as initiation. Take, for example, this warden-leaning triple frontline front-to-back drafted by DRX at Worlds 2022 semifinals versus Gen G. Given the range at which this particular comp plays, as well as the range of their opponents, Gragas' ultimate and Vera's ultimate do serve as proper teamfight initiation. Keeping this point in mind allows us to get much more creative when drafting for warden comps. The triple backline variant is also self-explanatory. It consists of 2 frontliners and 3 backliners. Often this means 2 carries and an enchanter, but on rare occasions it can also mean 3 carries. The generic triple backline composition tends to allow more threats to slip into their backline, but given that the backline should be built to protect each other, it's usually slightly better at dealing with those threats, making it on average more flank resistant. Triple backline is generally better at kiting backwards than pushing forwards, which would imply that it's your default variant for dealing with highly committal aggression. The generic Bruiser thrives in this composition when an enchanter is present. They're needed to supplement the initiator and provide a strong frontline buff target for their enchanter for when the backline isn't being threatened. Here are some examples of triple backline comps. The first 2 are inoffensive enchanter comps, the first being completely standard and the second running 2 initiators using Karma to push short-ranged carries forwards. The next 2 are very stable 3 carry comps. Running a utility-heavy mage support or a defensive top lane carry like Gangplank makes the backline much more resilient despite their damage focus. The last 2 introduce a common problem when you attempt to draft a reasonably defenseless support. The backline alone in the first comp cannot handle any flankers, which means that Gragas' attention would need to be solely on peel, severely limiting Jarvan's options. If you do choose to run a support who demands protection, they need to be either supplemented by a backline utility champion elsewhere, or they should only be drafted when you know the enemy cannot reach your backline without going directly through your frontline. The Bruiser Wall variant is when things start to get less orthodox. Bruiser Wall, also called Pure Death Ball, is a variant in which one or more of your primary carries is actually a frontliner. The Bruiser Wall contains teamfight frontliners or mid-rangers that generally don't have the means or reason to flank or to fully commit to dive, and who therefore commit to the front-to-back formation. They thrive in mindless, direct combat, especially when a utility champion sits behind them. The actual formation is a lot messier and more malleable. While this does mean that Bruiser Wall is the variant most capable of marking a flanker without breaking formation, and the best at standing in ring formation, it also makes it relatively poor at protecting the few backliners it does have once an enemy gains backline access. This is exacerbated by the wall being the least willing to kite backwards to protect their backline of all variants, since this time frontliners have DPS responsibilities. Here are a few examples of a Bruiser Wall. You'll notice that this variant is the least reliant on a true initiator, since as a rule they thrive against shorter ranged comps and probably should not be picked into poke. The vast majority of Bruiser Walls supplement themselves with a backline utility champion. Seraphine in particular is valued highly, but sometimes you can go even more brain off than that and just fill your direct death ball frontline with as many threats as you can handle. Bruiser Wall is a very different style of front to back. Last is the mono carry variant. This is a volatile variant in which you put all of your eggs in one basket in exchange for the benefits of triple frontline plus access to an enchanter. This variant must supplement the carry's damage across the remaining champions, but if the right pieces get ahead, then it's by far the best variant at aggressively taking space. A snowballing mono carry can accelerate the game pace much more effectively than more traditional variants. A mono carry with a carry who has fallen behind is dysfunctional. If you can draft high damage bruisers or a high damage enchanter, then you can reduce the volatility a bit. Still, hyper carries are a must here. Here are a few examples. Note the trend: 3 frontliners, carry, utility. If you deviate from this too much, you start to get into the territory of a hyper carry enchanter comp, which values a different mindset than the front to back archetype. In most cases, your solo carry will be drafted for the bot lane. If you can get creative enough in your draft, it's not against any rules to build a mono carry front to back around your mid laner or even your jungler instead. Now we understand the core variants of front to back as well as the classes of champions that typically populate it, but we're lacking some specificity on the champion front. We don't have a complete picture on the interplay of our frontline champions, nor have we identified our standard core champions, nor have we talked about the weird situational picks. So let's very quickly take a second pass on our core classes in order to introduce specifics before moving on to comp execution. Be aware that not every champion we cover is best enabled by a front-to-back comp. In fact, I'm going to show all 162 champions. I just find it important to highlight those who can play the archetype in case we have to work around champion pool limitations or hard pivot from an awkward draft state. On the initiator front, there are no surprises. The generalized class description identifies our core initiators for us quite well. But if we choose to draft 2 initiators, we need to make sure that one can cover the other defensively. For example, Ornn Leona is a much stronger duo than Ornn Amumu within this archetype. Our situational initiators are generally easy to understand, so I'll highlight only a few. Nautilus's lack of durability and single target nature is a problem for a comp that calls for initiators to buy a lot of time. However, he's one of our fastest engage options for dealing with poke damage or overzealous forward positioning in a backwards moving comp. Kled is not a traditional initiator. However, if the enemy comp is composed entirely of squishies and you also manage to find a playable Kled matchup, his ultimate supports the entire formation. Now, importantly, we've been talking about frontliners as our initiators, but we do have one other option. Ashe exists as a strong enabler to Warden comps, provided that the Ashe player is accurate with ultimates. As far as bruisers go, Trundle is king. If anyone at all on the enemy team is vulnerable to Trundle, he fits our description of the generic bruiser perfectly. Catch tools, immediate support to frontline via movement speed, not too cooldown reliant. Gangplank, while generally a backwards moving third carry, fits well into formation and supports his frontline in exactly the ways a more standard bruiser would. Most of our situational bruisers rely on the enemy having short range. Unironically, in a short-ranged game, Singed can fill Trundle's exact niche. He's genuinely excellent in the archetype as long as the enemies play at a comfortable distance. A few bruisers fit greatly into front to back sometimes, but are prone to transforming the composition into a flank comp. In order for Aatrox and Gnar to truly fight front to back, they need utility behind them and short-ranged opponents, respectively. Lastly, some bruisers work in the archetype, but only in the Bruiser Wall variant. Otherwise, they either don't provide enough, break formation, or take resources away from the true carries. The core Wardens are all frequently valued in triple Frontline and would all be picked for a similar disengage and peel reason. The situational options are meant to answer very specific threats. Tahm Kench deserves a callout for being front-to-back's best answer to flank comps. You'll notice a few flank initiators in here like Poppy or Maokai. As mentioned earlier, if these champions play in formation, their engage is stunted, and so their defensive capabilities are what we value. There's not a lot of mid-range options to consider. Our most common options are secondary or even tertiary carries who play very nicely with the frontline. I'll highlight Swain for just being a general problem to his opponents when in formation, and Heimerdinger for only properly fitting into the composition when he's a support. Silas is also notable. Much like Aatrox, he's more likely to turn your comp into a flank teamfight rather than front to back, but if the enemy has great ultimates for a Silas within formation, he's more than happy to stay with his teammates. It should be clear why these specific marksmen are desirable, that being their range, damage, or utility. Sivir is the former queen of front-to-back, but is joined by Jinx, Senna, and Varus as your best candidates for generalists. Graves and Kindred need special attention. They fit the role of carries within Warden comps quite well, but their default positions as junglers mean that the comp has to be built more specifically around them. Our primary carries don't need to be your mid lane or an ADC, but doing anything else requires either a utility champion in one of those roles, or a specially designed 3-carry triple backline. Now there's also a few more marksmen which can be played within front to back with no crippling issues, but all of these champions either impose some weirdness or are far better optimized by other archetypes. Our core mages are, predictably, immobile DPS or burst champions. Note Karthus's or Cassiopeia's conf building costs given their range or potential positions. Here are the solo poke champions. Xerath and Vel'Koz aren't ideal team fighters, but if you find a valid third carry game, they can fit in nicely. We also have a few oddball situational carries, all of which are just uber defensive picks. Xayah and Nico being anti-dive, Anivia being a control champion who very rarely does find a home in teamfight comps. And lastly are our utility champs, otherwise known as enchanters and Malzahar. Anyone not in the list of core champions either takes too much protection, has more situational aggressive value, or just has an awkward but sometimes viable role. To cover our bases, we'll explicitly mention the assassins, flank-reliant teamfighters, and formation breakers who just do not, under any circumstances, fit into front-to-back. If you draft any of these champions, you are no longer playing a front-to-back composition. But we do have a tiny number of hyper-niche exceptions to our no assassins or skirmishers rule. Firstly, believe it or not, Gwen and Fiora have a place in our backlines. These champions have one purpose: to be the biggest nuisance possible to their direct lane opponents. Usually, that's achieved by marking enemy flankers, but in very niche situations in which their direct opponents can't be easily marked and can gain semi-reliable access to the backline from behind without access to heavy CC, the Kled versus Fiora matchup as an example, these champions slot into the backline. Secondly, we have Yone, the only assassin who doesn't necessarily mind fighting in formation. Yes, he will have moments of breaking formation, and yes, he has games in which he likes to flank, but he doesn't hate approaching directly, especially in Bruiser Wall. He performs fine against enemy tanks, and leaving your E-Spirit within the formation can be appealing. To reiterate, these are niche weirdos. Don't assume drafting them gives you a front-to-back comp. You just need this knowledge to identify when they should be played as backliners. While we're learning how to approach the game as a front-to-back composition, I'd like to stress early that there's more to the game than raw 5v5. Teamfight compositions are prone to the common mistake of drafting purely for mid-game, failing to secure comfortable lane matchups or any proactive lane phase value. Front-to-back's honesty in combat is a double-edged sword. On the one hand, having a purely mid-game oriented strategy means that you'll frequently find games in which you're not the team that's pressured to accelerate game pace. On the other hand, you inherently don't have super creative comeback mechanics beyond trying to slow the game pace. If you can't farm or win the honest teamfight because you've been snowballed on too heavily, you will seriously struggle to win the game. So to play any teamfight composition, especially front-to-back, you need to know how to play a fundamentally clean early game. You don't have to dominate, and sometimes you don't even need to be ahead. You just need to familiarize yourself with the concept of game pace, recognize when to speed it up and when to slow it down given which champions are on the map and who may be vulnerable, and if you're trying to slow it down, concede what the enemy has earned through their inherent advantages. To reiterate, we want early advantages, we'll take the advantages given to us through our lane phase dynamics, but we don't need early advantages, we just need to prevent the enemy from snowballing out of control. Note that this also means that we want our jungler interacting with our carries more than our frontline during the lane phase whenever possible. If a pure tank's lane collapses, that's not nearly as bad as a carry's lane collapsing, especially since this archetype only has so many carries. Similarly, our pure tanks getting all of the kill gold doesn't progress our win condition at all. Obviously, if the jungler is one of our primary carries, then selfish pathing for personal gain is desirable. If the circumstances of the game make it impossible to path towards bot lane, then it's highly likely for most front-to-back compositions that the early game will be played around the mid-jungle 2v2. A stable early game that keeps our jungler relevant is more important than heavily snowballing our bot lane in most cases. What skews the game in favor of high honesty teamfight is the summoner spell economy. Every moment between major objectives for front-to-back is preparation for the next teamfight, where the goal is to maintain a moderate game pace. Front-to-back teams will generally focus on developing towards their next item spikes, making low-risk plays and farming well. But only farming doesn't always win you the next teamfight. If front-to-back should always be drafted with an initiator, then they should usually have the means to manufacture a skirmish or a catch that threatens summoner spells. It might take several minutes of playing the map to set this up, but that's okay. Even if the enemy rejects the play, conserving their summoners by conceding what you've earned, that develops your spikes. The standard front-to-back in the mid-game should be making low-frequency but high-impact plays with the sole purpose of winning that next objective fight. Of course there's nuance to it, sometimes playing faster is correct depending on the game state, but because we're analyzing archetypes rather than specific compositions, it is not possible to go more in depth. That's just the introductory baseline mindset. The funniest part of a front-to-back is that as the level of play increases, the frequency of actual front-to-back teamfights plummets. The reason for this is that when your teamfight is as honest as possible, top teams can trivially predict who will win. If they think they can break your formation via flank, they take the fight. If you're set up and they don't have the resources, they simply concede the fight. Why even bother approaching that? Front-to-back, in making plays to burn enemy summoner spells and ultimates, or to make pre-objective picks, frequently prevents the very teamfight they're designed for, which is okay as long as you're developing your win condition. Skirmish execution is therefore another important topic for front-to-back. How should this archetype approach small skirmishes when they're designed for 5v5? Ultimately, skirmishes within this archetype are still about enabling your carries. The vast majority of your plays, assuming no egregious enemy mistakes, should revolve around a sub-formation, using the pieces you have available to create a frontline and backline for whichever carry you're making the play around. Within this subformation, you have to be very aware of which pieces you're missing. Is your primary peel, disengage, or engage on the other side of the map? If so, that naturally changes the skirmishes available to you. You can't hard force despite enemy setup if you're lacking a way to defend your carries. The only time a skirmish won't involve a primary carry is if the map is in such a state that your Bruiser, if you have one, can take a guaranteed winning 2v2, 3v3, or pick with the fellow frontliners. You can actually find games in which that Bruiser skirmish becomes the driving force of your early to mid game. Our Bruiser within front-to-back should also be considered as our alternate win condition. If they get unusually fed early into the game, the frontline and enchanters should not be afraid to play around the Bruiser rather than the planned carries. Remember that the frontline can be viewed as its own distinct entity from the backline. At least in the triple frontline variant, it's already designed to support that skirmish. It's important to note, though, that the generic Bruiser scales worse than the generic carry within non-Bruiser Wall front-to-back. In the event that you find yourselves in a fast-paced Bruiser carry game, it's important to either maintain that pace and close out the game via snowball, or to make sure that the carries can profit when it comes to team fighting around that Bruiser. One of the highest complexity skirmishes that a front-to-back composition regularly has to deal with is the second dragon. If the second Drake occurs during the lane phase, some specific front-to-backs find it very hard to take given which responsibility is held by their top laner. To actually secure an objective without a 50-50, you need to be capable of either turning on the enemy or burning it before the enemy can reach the objective. Triple backline variants regularly struggle with this. If their top laner is the initiator, they can't reliably turn. If their jungler is the core disengage, they usually can't leave the dragon pit to zone. Most enchanters struggle as the solo zone potential, especially if the enemy jungler has mobility. Even Renata can't just wander behind the pit alone. Obviously, having an initiator as either your support or jungler reduces the complexity of this skirmish, and a post-lane Drake grants you greater access to your top laner. But if you find yourself dealing with this common problem, you have a few questions to ask. Is it okay to concede this Drake? Is it okay to coin flip it since you think you'll gain more from the follow-up fight even if the enemy steals the Drake? Since this is still a lane phase Drake, can we take it off bot prio alone? Can you sync the second Drake with your top laner's second TP, allowing them to move for the objective and return to the lane without suffering major losses? If not, can you justify those top lane losses? Just keep in mind that there's rarely any harm in conceding a single Drake as a teamfight archetype, especially if that Drake isn't Hextech or Mountain. We've emphasized that the formation is everything, but that's only true in combat. While taking space and setting up an objective, the carries will be playing within skirmish structures, but we may be incentivized to ditch the formation. Certain frontliners may prefer to break off and use their individual power to chase away isolated foes while the team establishes their vision and position. Take a few quick examples. King in on Gragas, denying river space from Chovy's Rise. Impact on Gangplank, standing out of formation to prevent enemies from taking river space back. Even our textbook front-to-back clip from the beginning opened with Ornn recognizing that the formation doesn't suit his needs. While playing front-to-back, you need to make sure that you can quickly build your formation for the sake of teamfighting. You don't need to stay in formation for every individual task within a game, even when your teammates are involved. At this point, I need to emphasize that the point of the formation is not to restrict options. Your archetype should guide your strategy, it shouldn't stifle creativity or snap decision-making. Remember the formation breakdown from our example at the beginning of the video. It is completely natural to dissolve the formation once it has served its purpose. So, with that in mind, any fight that is won before it begins technically doesn't require you to restrict yourself only to the structure your comp is designed around. So this brings us to the confusing role of flanking within front-to-back. If the enemy is grossly out of position, you cannot hesitate to punish them because you're too attached to the idea of the formation. It's completely fine to flank for a pick provided that the flank enables you to fall back into formation should a larger skirmish break out. See here as G2, running a front-to-back with more than enough utility to justify Aatrox fighting in formation, takes an absurd out-of-formation Jarvan ultimate with the understanding that they have the resources to delay, chase, build formation, and win the game on the spot. What I'm trying to communicate is that you need to keep your non-standard options in mind, especially when we're given the opportunity to accelerate the game from a winning position. Front-to-back is not designed to flank, so of course it's not our default strategy, but we should not allow the enemy's mistakes to go unanswered simply because we're too married to the pure theory of our composition. Flanking within front-to-back is one moment in which intuition is more valuable than intellect within a game, but it's not the most important example of such simply because it's something that can be developed at the individual level. Front-to-back is a coordination-dependent archetype, especially in terms of how the frontline interacts with each other, and coordination can't always be developed by comms. At all times, the frontline champions must understand their combat roles. Who is the initiation, disengage, or peel? Critically, disengage and peel are completely different concepts. Disengage means that you're focused on zoning and denying space from the enemy while preventing their backline access, while peel means that you're anticipating, removing, and mitigating threats who have reached your backline. Many frontliners are capable of performing more than one role, so to understand which champion is responsible for which role, you need to look at which champion is best at each in your comp. Take, for example, the frontline of Sejuani, Gragas, and Taric. Against a shorter ranged composition, Gragas is capable of playing all three frontline combat roles effectively, but compare him against his teammates. Gragas has strong peel potential, but Taric is more effective in that role. Gragas has reasonable but unreliable initiation, while Sejuani's is much stronger. Neither Taric nor Sejuani are excellent at zoning off enemies though, so Gragas would default to the role of primary disengage. If Taric were not present, Gragas may need to fall back and peel, identifying which of disengage or peel would be more urgent. If Sejuani were not present and Gragas saw a perfect pick opportunity, then he would make an aggressive play with his ultimate. But as long as his teammates are near and capable of performing their jobs, Gragas, with his ordered list of responsibilities, would never accidentally cast a redundant spell. In a perfect world, your frontline players are practiced enough at combat role identification that it shouldn't need to be communicated. It's an intuition skill after all, but while learning how to play the composition, it's not a bad idea to spend some of your setup phase talking about this concept and getting yourselves on the same page. Front-to-back's generalized matchup spread against other archetypes isn't super polarizing simply because there are so many ways to build a front-to-back composition, but it's also not winning all of its matchups by default. Usually, you're only getting a strategic victory through a late utility pick tailored to the situation. When approaching your matchup, remember that an unprotected carry is your doomsday scenario. Front-to-back is inherently a semi-defensive archetype even in its most aggressive forward-moving variants, simply because it takes longer to get into your face than something like a dive comp would. Front to back can usually handle dive teamfight well unless your specific variant contains insufficient peel. Wombo comps can devastate your backline, but only the longest ranged combos should be able to make it through your frontline in most scenarios. Many variants of front to back can struggle against heavy poke, since kiting back is never favorable against siege damage, but obviously drafting initiators and long-range DPS of your own helps you to force. Pick comps are very threatening during setup, but should have no answer to your formation. Reaching a teamfight is the win condition in this matchup. If you're against pure aggro, try to slow the game down. If you're against pure control, try to speed it up. We'll be able to cover these matchups in more detail when we talk about the other archetypes. Just for now, assume the generic front to back is very slightly losing against most other archetypes until you draft specific answers on B5 or R5 to handle your opponent's threats. I generally consider flank teamfight to be front to back's worst archetypical matchup, even though front to back can be designed to handle it more effectively. While triple backline is usually fairly good at handling an isolated flanker, introduce 2 or some threatening AoE and we can quickly encounter problems. The biggest reason flank is an issue is that the circular formation is easier to force through than the single file. See as an example this losing teamfight from DRX in which they're missing some key disengage from Gragas as he attempts to mark Rise. You could criticize Pioshik for getting himself into a position in which Nautilus ult cannot be reacted to, but looking at it from a productive compositional standpoint, Wardens as initiators need more direct follow-up. Had Gen G been playing a less extreme flank comp allowing Gragas to stay in formation, he does buy enough time for Kindred to flash to safety and carry, but alas, he's forced to mark Rise. So flank teamfight regularly forces front to back into uncomfortable choke points as they pressure from multiple angles. What can front to back do about it? Well, for one, drafting Tahm Kench is often a cheat code for this matchup, but what if we're already in game without him? Marking the enemy is usually not something front to back is great at. It usually breaks formation, but it's very possible from the right position on the map. See this example in which Inspired's Trundle can play anti-flank against Maple's Ahri without breaking formation since EG chooses to position themselves around this bush. Note that Maple has to misplay heavily to die here, and that EG's position is inherently not a strong contest to the Drake, so this method has its downsides. Typically, the best option is to capitalize during the flank setup, threatening flank's backline immediately before flankers can threaten yours, but given the generic front to back's engage speed, you need to be quick on your decisions to execute this. A mirror matchup, no matter the archetype, will emphasize the strengths of certain champions and increase their priority in draft. In the front-to-back mirror, we can gain slight edges by drafting superior scaling and range. Greedier utility champions can be drafted once we know for sure that our opponent is also playing front-to-back. Soraka, for example, is very hard to deal with when both teams are fighting in formation. We heavily value long-ranged single-file CC. Spells like Veigar E, Renata Ultimate, and Seraphine Ultimate dominate the front-to-back mirror matchup since the counterplay to these spells is to flank. Remember that both teams will have heavy front lines to punch through, increasing the value of AoE tank busters like Brand and Sivir, who may also incidentally damage the backline. I've listed Jinx alongside the other high-value mirror champions simply because her combination of range, damage, and scaling is desirable in this context. At the end of the day though, when playing front-to-back versus front-to-back, draft can only take you so far. In my experience, this is a very execution-heavy mirror matchup. Who secures summoner spell advantages? Who has a more coordinated frontline? Who skirmishes more effectively? Draft advantages cannot matter in purely honest teamfight if one side simply has more resources than the other through gameplay, so while range is your friend in this context, it is not your savior. With all said and done, we've examined the minute details of the front-to-back teamfight archetype, how it plays, what champions fit into it, the common problems you can encounter, and the reasons it's a fantastic archetype for teams who are just starting to play and learn together. We've also used it to introduce the basic premise of archetype theory, which I believe is an incredibly powerful and flexible tool in developing your macro game plans. Even this amount of information is just scratching the surface on archetype theory though. There are still so many archetypes and variants left to understand, so I hope you'll join me on my journey of exploring them all. Needless to say, this video was only made possible by an immense amount of research and by support from all of you. Shout out to my composition research team for helping me in testing my hypotheses and for dramatically speeding up the learning process. If you enjoyed this video and would like to see further archetype breakdowns or champion guides in the future, please don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe, and please consider supporting me on Patreon or Ko-fi. Special thanks to my first patrons, Sonic5040 and Mel7401. I appreciate your support greatly.